Now we've got Mark Lewis, who is from Optimus, and he's going to come and talk about Te Auaunga Away, or Oakley Creek. So welcome, Mark.
Kia ora te whānau. Thanks for sticking around. It's been a really interesting day, I think. Lots of diverse talks that I found very interesting personally. And thanks for inviting me to talk to Te Auaunga. It's no Shanshui city, but it's been a labour of love for me for the last dozen years or so. So it's been quite a good opportunity to consolidate some of that history for me and see where it started, see where it ended up as well. So the project is a Auckland Council Health and Waters flood reprofiling project, effectively through these two reserves on the right-hand side, Underwood and Wormsley reserves, between Sandringham Road and Richardson Road in the heart of Mount Roskill in Tāmaki Makaurau. The intent of the project is to pass forward flood flows from the upper catchment area around Keithway Park through the site and down to the Waterview Connection project, where there are wider floodplains that can accommodate that. And the purpose is fairly obvious. This is a flood map, which is just for the immediate catchment around the drainage reserves that were the focus of the project. And yeah, it's a low-lying area, and yes, the infrastructure there is under capacity. But the problem is more historic in some sense, in that thousands of years ago, from the north, from the top of the screen there, the lava from Oahu, Mount Albert, came down and joined hands, well, sort of joined feet really, but that's a bit harder to do. Joined feet with Puketapa, with the lava flows from Puketapa. And they formed a bit of an impound there at Richardson Road, and that held back Wairakatu, the ancestral wetland, Te Repo, Te Puna, throughout this area, which you can see very clearly on this map. And unfortunately, mid-century last, Housing New Zealand determined that they were going to build a housing estate there, with the obvious sort of outcomes of pretty regular flooding through the area, and combined sewer overflows and all those other nice things as well. Although that family seems to be quite enjoying themselves out of sewage. And so there were a few attempts to rectify the situation, going back even to the 1930s and some Public Works Acts projects there, primarily sort of donkey and dynamite type work really. And then more recently, our engineering brethren doing some brutal responses to the problem. And unfortunately this sort of characterises a lot of those two reserves. Unfortunately the problem still existed, and so you can see in this plan here that there's almost a perfect alignment between the flooding zones and the single house dwelling. And of course those 200 odd homes, they're regularly inundated, and their poor infrastructure effectively abandoned, if you like. So, and probably what's awful and what's compounding the issue is that this is one of the most diverse neighbourhoods in Aotearoa. We're talking first generation New Zealanders, refugees and so on. So already quite challenged by economic and social circumstances, now with these compounding factors too. So not a great story. But when I put the slide in last night, it reminded me of a talk that I saw by, I'm sort of diverting just for a second, but I'll come back around. A talk I saw by Anne Spurn, 15 years ago or something. She was a professor at UPenn. She does a lot of sort of design through justice type work. And she looked at a small town in western Pennsylvania, and in that town, the same deal again, lots of flooding, combined sewer overflows, and even sinkholes in that situation. So houses were just sort of disappearing under the street. And in that situation, it was a long-time problem, and it was intergenerational poverty. So what Anne did was she taught the local kids how to use GIS. And they found out that in the distant past, they had filled a stream and filled the floodplains and filled the wetlands, and that's where they built the town. And the remarkable thing was that these kids, on realising that that the community it wasn't, their neighbourhood wasn't shit because of them, it wasn't because of their community, but it was because of town planners and municipal engineers who had already died a long time ago. And so that flipped, in a way, their own view of themselves and their self-esteem. And that realisation became a catalysing agent for them and their community to approach federal housing, federal and state agencies to do more green infrastructure solutions for their problem, including daylighting the stream that was there previously. So, yeah, sorry for that side, but that occurred to me last night. It's a very interesting proposition in terms of the landscapes, the spaces that we're creating have a huge impact on people's identity and on their self-esteem, and I think that's always worth remembering. It's a flood reprofiling project, which is not especially saucy, but it was in an area where there was almost a virtuous circle of things occurring, an intersection of a whole bunch of infrastructure projects. So, Central Interceptor, there's the Te Auaunga Greenway, which was about 16 k's along that stream, and of course State Highway 20, Stoddard Town Centre. So all these things sort of happening in that same place, which made us sort of think to ourselves, well, instead of flood management, why not sort of flood retrenchment to enable growth and start to create some opportunities in this neighbourhood. And this is before Weasley Precinct and Kaingaroa's sort of large-scale redevelopment. And this was the brand new unitary authority of Auckland Council. So they didn't really have the appetite for a paradigm shift to become a developer. But they did see the opportunity for rezoning and for intensified housing development, so high density living. But of course then, where does that leave your community? So remember that these guys have long suffered flooding and infrastructure issues, and already they were disenfranchised to a degree. Now we were going to take away their open space, for which they only had a paucity of anyway, and we were going to have the impacts of construction effects for 2 years. And at the end of it, what would happen to their social fabric in terms of this high density living? So to their credit, Auckland Council focused very promptly on that community. And there were a lot of events and open days and that sort of thing to introduce the project, to understand the community's points of view. And a lot of those events were set up and run, coordinated by the community themselves. And then we worked really closely as well with the community liaison group, or friends group, and really embedded and motivated community members who hugely improved our understanding of community and their needs. And we had quite focused workshops with them around co-design, but also regular check-ins as well. And I think the important thing to remember is, after the fact, if we're going to have high density living in this neighbourhood, going from single story to high density, these open spaces, even though they're just drainage reserves, become people's backyards effectively. They become the places that they socialise and that they gather. They become the place to detune from the sort of the stressors of the urban environments. I think anyone who's went to their local park during COVID can see the importance of well-being in our open spaces. And this is one of the open days. I just put this in there to be joyful, really. Can't not smile and see that. But before we go forward, let's go back. And one of the first approaches from Auckland Council Health and Waters, who led the project. was to Mana Whenua, and there were 7 iwi represented by kaitiaki on the project. And they were massively important in the sense that they gave us a mandate to restore Wairakatoura, to restore the awa, to restore Te Repo, to restore the Waimori. And they immediately, of course, saw that there was this necessity, this fundamental to manaakitanga for the local community too, that needed to be a massive part of the project. And they provided us with this whakaro, this plan that would be incorporated through all elements of the project, which was the restoration of Wairakatoura, that ancestral wetland. And so what Healthy Waters had was this. What they'd start off with was a pretty boring profiling project. What it had become was they were building green infrastructure ahead of built form. So they were doing things very much the right way, in my opinion. They were building an environmental framework that supported a built development. So onto the project itself. I can probably speak for a whole presentation about the stream stuff. It involves an interpretive dance too. But I'll just give you a short version of it. So you remember that the stream previously was pretty much just channelized and dead straight and concrete lined and rock armoured and the rest of it. This is what we were sort of encountering as we were creating the channel, which is this really lovely peat that was there from the wetlands. And you can see also a bit of alluvium in there in the bottom of the channel, where from the original watercourse. And then we also encountered these basalt lobes that almost appeared randomly through the landscape. And just over a few metres, you had hard basalt that was breaking drills, and clays, stiff clays and ash and scoria and all manner of things. So we had a few different stream profiles to work with based on some of these geologies and some of the constraints of the site. Some wide floodplains for active meandering streams, and more entrenched through the basalt areas that would be much more, here's my dancing again, much more hydraulically efficient designs, which would allow us to save more open spaces. And of course, pull riffle run sequences, cascades, to add that heterogeneity, that diversity, that natural character to the stream environment. And we had a tin, of course, like a 3D model, and it was useful to an extent in that water went from A to B, and we kept the water generally inside the drainage reserves. But it was primarily designed by Digger and Dazzle at the end of the day. This is a before picture. It's actually not too bad. I've got to find a worse one. But we created this meander profile, and we didn't want it to actively meander in this particular location, so there was some hardening to it. Where we had stiff clays and that sort of thing, was just the parent material, but the kohatu, the rock that you're seeing here, is all excavated from other parts of the site, so we're reusing rock on the project. We're reusing woody debris as well from trees that were felled to accommodate this floodplain. And then there's the layering of the planting on top. So I'm really looking forward to the next sort of 10 years when the different forest types come up and through there, the kānaka and the broadleaf kakatea forest. And Mana Whenua quite correctly said, well, if you're going to restore Wairakatoura, you're not going to put dirty water into it. And so there are GPTs for all of the intakes into this, and from the adjacent catchment. And a challenge, of course, to do the same upstream. And then it was filtered through bioswales and across riparian terraces and floodplains before it entered the Awa, and then point source treatment with rain gardens as well. This one a little bit further on. It's a bit more embedded into the landscape now. So the community in Mana Whenua requested and inspired us to create some spaces within these reserves for learning and for storytelling and for celebration. And the local community were really keen for a whare/whare to be a centre point for the community. And we were really graced by the presence of Felipe Tohi, who is a Tongan artist. That's him there on the right, and that's Tessa Harris as well. On the left-hand side, they're doing some binding together at the whare. And so Felipe is Tongan, and about 60% of the local school that were just adjacent to the whare are Tongan as well. So it was a really good cultural fit. And that sits within an artia space within the centre of the park. And we borrowed one of Felipe's sunrise colours to bridge the awa from the school to the artia space. And we also picked up on the rafters, the manu pattern that he had in the rafters, to create this sort of geology broken back sort of bridge that's sort of leaping from the school to the artia space. In a similar way, its sister bridge downstream does the same thing, leaping from the foot to the tihi of Oauraka. And the colours there are mainly around what we'd unearthed in terms of geologies and things like that. And these bridges are hugely important for the local community, because before paths and bridges were in here, they ran through grass and across narrow pipe bridges, and because it was heavily used to get to work and to get to school, and at all hours of the night, because there are a lot of shift workers in this community. So the shared paths, I think, were a really massive outcome for the community. And of course we had boardwalks as well to cross some of the restored wetland environments and those water treatment systems. And then also to connect across the wetland and stream to these more usable open spaces within the reserve. And then also lots of, when it was us playing, really, us and the constructors, around creating all these informal crossing points for the kids to discover and explore. And they were also made from the kohatu and the rako, the logs from the site. And then the manu pattern again from Tohi, from Felipe Tohi, and from, well, I should say that he worked closely with McCoy Honey Architects on that whare, and on this furniture suite as well. And so it was a nice sort of geometry to have in the project, in the sense that it was good contrast to the more organic forms of the stream and the restored environments. And we incorporated it into the boardwalk as well, which had this bi-directionality to it, which was a nice kind of combination to it. Kind of encourages you to stay right, which was interesting. Now to the fun stuff, so I'm a little bit out of time. We did a bunch of workshops with schools and kindies and so on in the local area, and they had some pretty cool ideas. So Kyle and Quinn here, they've got a zip line across the creek and a tunnel going under it, and a dragon and all sorts of stuff there. So there's some good ideas from them. But the cool thing about talking with the kids was that they wanted rocks to skip over, and they wanted trees to climb, and they wanted to fight to the teeth and play make-believe and all these sorts of things, which is really great to hear from urban kiddies. And as well, there were some really sensitive responses in terms of treating the water, in terms of finding homes for tuna, for the fish, and for the birds. So we set out to create these wild places, these kind of Fantasia treetop destinations for the kids that Playground Centre would have loved us, really. It would have been $1 million in their bank account. But unfortunately, you recall I was talking about how it was the right way around to build green infrastructure before you built the built form. Unfortunately, that's not how the funding cycles work. So we didn't have the funding for the playgrounds, but we had a huge expectation from the community, so we had to do a bit of scrounging. And we had a little bit of leftover landscape budget, and we found these Te Auaunga, 20,000 plus year old swamp coating that was being unearthed in Te Kanani. and they were going straight into a chipper or being reburied. So we saved them. And the kohatu as well, the beautiful columnar stuff, all sorts of things that we were taking from the site as well. And we created these wild places as best we could, over a bunch of frosty mornings and diggers and logs and a few old power poles and gun logs and things like that. And but we wanted to be a bit more special. We wanted to draw again to the theme, the whakaaro of Wairakatoda and its restoration. And gratefully, we are grateful that that Hako Brown, who's there bottom right, he agreed to be our cultural advisor for this part of the project. And we started to explore the possibilities for Ngāro Taka sort of traditional play and Marahupara traditional playgrounds. And so the kauru rising up through the roots rising through the forested components of the project and the kopapa, connecting between them as they would have done as runs between the trees for hunting birds. And similarly across the wetlands, connecting across the wetlands as the keke would have done as well, placed across the wetland as ways to traverse. I'm at a time, I might just bang on through. And then giving deference to Awaraka, which is the creator of Wairakatoda and also the source of our kohatu and so on. So as amazing and as fun as working with Marahupara was, I think local boards got a sniff of like how inexpensive it was to put together and started to cut and paste Marahupara into all of their open spaces. So I would just caution, I suppose, or encourage people not to roughly appropriate these things, but to utilise them, when it speaks to a whakaaro of a project, when it speaks to, when it's invited by the local iwi and hapu. So, but anyway, enough speech on that. So the Bmx Track, similarly, no budget, no approval, so we had a little bit of budget left over from the path. So we just made a really bendy, curvy path. And we had a digger driver who was a mad BMXer, so he helped us with that. I need to probably talk to the social procurement aspects of the project as well. And it was great, the community was so involved in terms of co-design and that they were involved in setting up and running and the open days and the events and so on. Healthy Waters wanted to go further, and I give a shout out to Tom Mansell, who's the project manager with Healthy Waters, and to Amy Donovan, who is the Community Development Arts and Culture at the time for Healthy Waters as well. And but they worked with Pukta, the local board, and the training institute, the Unitec, that a lot of you know, and they had this apprenticeship scheme that all the tenderers, all the constructors going for the project could draw from this group of young people from the local area. And Fulton Hogan, who won the project and did an extremely good job, they drew 8 of these guys and incorporated them into the project, and they went on to other firms and more training in some instances, but 2 of them kind of carried right through into other parts of Fulton Hogan. And then we worked with Te Whangai Trust, who set up a nursery at the local intermediate school, which became integrated into their syllabus. And they gave seconds and so on away to some of the environmental groups in the community. And they work with long-term unemployed, people suffering from alcohol and drug abuse, drug dependency rather. Sometimes out of prison, sometimes they've had mental health issues, but not in education, employment and training. And they provided this, what's key I think on this project and why a lot of these social procurement aspects worked really well was because the community was so embedded and invested in the project, and there was that wraparound support. So there was always an auntie to like get you out of bed or give you a petrol voucher so you get to work, look after your kids or whatever the case might be. That needs to be that wraparound support for these things to work. Way too many people to thank for this project. Can I go a little bit longer? 1 minute? I I think just in terms of some metrics, I suppose. So REMU did do some social and cultural evaluations for the project. Some of the interesting stuff was that, not unsurprisingly, there were more people using the paths and biking, and more kids in the park during the weekdays and weekends and that sort of thing. So that's all gratifying. But what was really nice was that they, and I'm not sure how they measured it entirely, but they found that the satisfaction with the parks, with the reserves, and that their pride in their community as a result of the restoration of those parks was significant. A score of 30 or 40 out of 100 of an increase in their satisfaction in living in that neighbourhood. So for me, that's really humbling, and it's sort of, that's why I was reminded of Anne Spurn's work, that really there's a great deal of importance in terms of our impacts on people's psyche and creating their environments.